Welcome to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We bring you news and analysis from the front lines of the global struggle for social and economic justice. I'm your host, Brianna Griffith, and here's what's going down in your backyard and across the world. For this week, we are continuing to cover the global protests against neoliberalism. This, I believe, will be one of our last episodes to feature this as part of a larger kind of global whole, because I don't feel that, as I've mentioned, I don't feel that they've gotten the kind of that broader context of understanding of this to be a kind of international phenomenon in the way that I believe is absolutely necessary. So today we're going to be focusing on the situation first in Colombia, and then we will talk a little bit about other socialist or left-leaning states within Latin America that have kind of successfully in the past overthrown this neoliberal model and brought about something of sort of a social change within their countries. So to talk about all this, we are joined once again by Dan Kovalik, a human rights and labor lawyer, the author of many books, including his latest, No More War. Thank you, Dan, for coming back on the show.
Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure to have you on. So as I've been starting all of these segments, I'd like to first delve into a little bit of the social and economic conditions in Colombia that led to the latest wave of protests. In Colombia in particular, it's taken the form of a sort of general national strike, which is an incredible accomplishment. Can you talk about essentially like what is it that people have been striking about since November in Colombia?
Yeah, well, Colombia has been one of the most unequal societies, not only in the Western Hemisphere, but really in the world for many years. You know, Colombia really represents the neoliberal model and represents the model that the U.S. would like to see throughout Latin America. It's unequal in terms of economic distribution, but also land distribution. Has one of the worst, distributions of land in the Americas, with a very small percentage of the population owning most of the arable land. Of course, that has been the source of the armed conflict, which has gone on since 1964. And while there was a peace agreement signed between the FARC guerrillas, the largest guerrilla group, and the government, in, I believe it was 2016, that peace agreement has largely fell apart. And it's fallen apart because the government has reneged on it. The FARC did what they were supposed to do. They laid down their arms. They went into these concentration zones and were supposed to be allowed to run as a political party. And, you know, the quick response of the government was to start killing FARC leaders. They killed, I believe, over 130 or so FARC, rank and file FARC members and leaders. And they've been killing social leaders in Colombia as well, with hundreds of social leaders being killed every year. The last statistic I saw regarding human rights defenders specifically was 85 killed this year. And so you have that backdrop of both, again, a huge income inequality, land inequality, and also state repression, you know, in order to maintain that inequality. And that state repression has ebbed and flowed a bit, but it's been pretty constant. And frankly, it's gotten worse since the peace deal was signed. I mean, what was very clear is once the guerrillas signed the agreement and laid down their arms, the government and their paramilitary friends decided it was an opportunity to start cleaning up the left and progressive forces, and that's what they've done. And so I think all that has led, you know, to the protests and the strike you see.
And of course, when you say cleaning up the left, of course, that's kind of a euphemism, not just for the repression generally speaking, but often the assassination. And in Colombia, that takes the particular form of assassination, often of indigenous leaders, union leaders, and whatnot. Since the kind of far right-wing president Ivan Duque assumed office in August 2018, 134 members of different indigenous movements have been assassinated. That's just in the essentially a little over a year. So that, among the many other statistics, I was kind of reading up on this. It's very like the numbers of the massacres at any given point in Colombia always seem to be much higher than what I've seen just studying the massacres of other kind of neoliberal governments. Like it's almost like everything kind of that level of repression does seem to be on steroids in many ways in Colombia with the Duque administration. So can you talk maybe, I mean, there are so many things I'd love to talk about, but can you talk about maybe the relationship between Duque, the kind of Colombian official police and military, and the paramilitaries that often kind of carry out this state violence? How do those two kind of relate? Is it anything comparable to the way a sort of fascist paramilitaries operate in other countries, such as kind of the Ukraine? Like, what's the level of kind of state versus private paramilitary cooperation?
Yeah, well, it's been well documented by many groups, including, your very standard human rights groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, that the Colombian state is very much tied into the paramilitaries, and that has been true for decades. In fact, we have to remember that Colombian, often they'll talk about the Salvador option when they talk death squads. And that, we were talking about something that arose in the 1980s in El Salvador. The paramilitaries have existed in Colombia since the 1960s. I mean, these are very much an integral part of this Colombian state, and by design. William Yarborough, the U.S. general who went to Colombia in 1962, it was his idea to create these paramilitary forces, first in Colombia and then elsewhere, so that they could carry out, the dirty deeds of the state without the state, either the Colombian state or U.S. government, being seen as culpable for those crimes. And so these paramilitaries are very closely linked to the military to the extent that they get their ammunition and weapons from the military. And in fact, the ranks of the paramilitaries are often filled with people who are, some who continue to work with the Colombian military and others that are former military people. So there's a very close relationship there. And when there are paramilitary incursions into areas, how it usually works is the paramilitaries come in first, do the, kind of the most violent actions to clean a population out of an area. And then the military comes in right behind them. And then you see this time and again. So yes, the relationship is very close.
And to sort of give an example of other sorts of repression, just to sort of set the scene of what it is that Colombia is engaging with. In early November, it was discovered, for instance, that essentially in August, somewhere between 8 and 18 children were killed in a bombing raid conducted by Colombian military in the department of Caqueta. They had claimed originally that those were left-wing guerrillas, but as it was later found out, of course, it was children. It was a massacre of children. There have been massacres of essentially farmers. There have been over and over again these massive massacres that are kind of known within the country as falsos positivos, false positives, where essentially it in many ways it's almost like the U.S. war on terror, where they've simply reclassified everybody that they kill as an enemy combatant to make it look like they don't have any civilian casualties. This has been going on for decades and decades, but this, among the other kind of killings of social leaders and the neoliberal austerity measures, has led, I think, to has led very much to kind of the moment we see today, which is the most massive strike that Colombia has seen, the most massive general strike national strike since 1977. Can you, maybe just lay out sort of what the situation is with regard to these strikes? What this sort of means in terms of like not only the coalitions coming together, the labor movement, LGBTQ groups, indigenous groups, but what the possibilities for kind of a major overhaul of Colombian society would be?
Yeah, well, the left in Colombia has always, it's always had a strong left. In fact, my Colombian friends always felt, embarrassed that it was Venezuela that went left before them with Hugo Chavez in 1998. They thought they would have the first, revolutionary government in the Andean region of South America. The problem is, well, there's many. I mean, again, the repression in Colombia has been uniquely terrible and awful, which has kept the left down, but also the left has been very divided amongst itself for various reasons. And it looks like, for the first time in a long time, the left is very much united. As you say, all types of groups are coalescing now, to possibly create real social change. I'd be, a little reluctant to predict, the toppling of the government, but certainly you're seeing a movement that has the potential for that, at the present. And really, it's long overdue, again, because we have to remember the Colombian government has really had a right-wing government, a series of right-wing governments since 2002. So you're looking almost 20 years, beginning with Alvaro Uribe, who was really terrible, and in which really the height of repression occurred under. And of course, not coincidentally, it was also the period of the greatest U.S. military aid to Colombia, about $10 billion. And during that time, you had thousands and thousands of people killed. You had the false positive scandal, which claimed at least 10,000 lives, which is now being investigated by the International Criminal Court. You had thousands of trade unionists killed. And again, this was a time when Colombia was receiving billions of dollars in U.S. aid. And again, the repression has continued even since that time, though, again, that was really the high watermark somewhere between 2002 and 2009. And one other statistic that Colombia has, which, again, people are largely unaware of, is it has had more forced disappearances than any other country in Latin America. Most people think of Argentina as the disappearance capital of the Americas during the Dirty War of the 70s, when 30,000 people were disappeared. At least 3 times that has been disappeared in Colombia. So, again, the people there have endured a great amount of repression, supported by the United States. The repression has been supported by the United States, and it's been effective, again, at keeping the left down. But I think now the people have just had enough. They had, some hope built up when the peace accords were signed. Those hopes were quickly dashed, and I think people are now taking matters into their own hands by taking to the streets.
I guess there are so many threads I'd like to follow, and the first is that what we've seen so many more gains from this kind of method of mass mobilization, like really rapid gains in terms of sort of the power relations between the people and these neoliberal right-wing governments. We've seen so much greater gains from these kind of mass mobilizations than we've seen in many, many years of electoral reform. There have been very few countries where any sort of electoral reform has actually kind of led to massive improvements, I think, in social conditions. Venezuela and Nicaragua would be the ones that kind of stand out there. So when we're thinking in terms of what is it that gets the goods, what is it that alleviates it, even if we're not talking about a revolution, even if we're just talking about alleviating the suffering of masses of people who are seeing their health care taken away, who are seeing their their jobs pay less and less, who are seeing increased homelessness, all of these sort of suffering that comes from essentially this economic stagnation and these austerity measures is alleviated most quickly when you have these kind of mass mobilizations through these kind of coalitions of organized groups. Again, unions have played a very large part in this. Different left-wing and socialist groups have played a different part. LGBTQ and indigenous groups, feminist groups, and community organizations, as well as collectives of political prisoners and organized groups of soccer fans, just looking at some of my notes here, are all the different groups that have taken part in this as this part of this coalition goes. And so I think, just to sort of hammer that point home, this organized resistance is what it is that gets the goods. I mean, it's what it is that alleviates the suffering and leads to sort of a shift in political power moving toward a revolution. So for those who are just tuning in, you are listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. We are joined by Dan Kovalik, a human rights and labor lawyer, as well as the author of many books, including his latest No More War, about the situations in Colombia. And we're also going to be talking about Venezuela and Nicaragua in just a bit. I'd like to sort of wrap up a little bit about the Colombian situation. Sort of what is it that really sparked off these protests? Was there kind of any particular point, and what's sort of does that organization look like? Seeing, for instance, that it's a continuation of sort of that national strike, that general strike tradition. What does that kind of union movement, I guess, look like in Colombia as well?
Yeah, well, again, Colombia has an old union movement that goes back over 100 years. It has had moments of great strength. It has been weakened greatly by assassinations. Again, we have to remember Colombia has been the trade union assassination capital of the world since 1986. I mean, that's an incredible fact, with thousands of union leaders and rank and file members killed since that time, which greatly weakened the labor movement to the point where at the low point, less than 1% of all workers were covered by a labor contract, which is pretty amazing. But still, the unions have maintained a certain level of militancy. The largest Colombia union federation in Colombia is the CUT, which again is fairly strong. And I think that this union movement and the CUT are some of the prominent leaders of this movement that's happening right now, but also indigenous groups, as you mentioned as well. There's almost 100 different indigenous groups in Colombia. It's an amazingly diverse population there, and also Afro-Colombian groups, which can't be forgotten either, that are active in this movement. I'm not sure there was any particular event that I know of that led to this, except that, this anger amongst the population is built up over some time. And I think events were inspired by what was happening in Chile, for example, where people have taken to the streets also against the neoliberal order there, and Haiti also, which again, poor Haiti gets very little coverage, but they've been having very strong protests for many months, and around 50 people have been killed there by the government. So, we see in general a foment that's happening throughout Latin America and truthfully the world. The Yellow Vest movement in France is an example of this as well, again, which doesn't get does not get the attention it deserves, I think.
Yeah, the both of those protests you just mentioned, the Yellow Vest and Haiti, are ones that have certainly been seen very much a media blackout. I covered the situation in Haiti with Kim Ives, the editor of the English section of Haiti Liberté, and it was a very interesting conversation. One of the points that I think was very important was that the Haiti protests actually began, I think, well over a year ago, with regard, like they've been going that strong for that long, over essentially the revelation that the Haitian government had been mismanaging the Petrocaribe money coming out of Venezuela, the Petrocaribe aid. So like it's also important to realize that these are all sort of connected, so that when the U.S. imposed these horrifying sanctions that have killed 40,000 people, according to the Center for Economic Policy and Research, the U.S. sanctions against Venezuela have killed 40,000 people. And one of the things that were sanctioned was even as going so far as to sanction the CLAP program. That is the food distribution program in Venezuela, received sanctions by the U.S. government. Again, these sanctions are illegal under international law, but the U.S. engages in this sort of gangsterism. Anyway, but one of the casualties of this, when the U.S. Put these sanctions in place, was that they sanctioned the kind of forces behind Petrocaribe, which was essentially a subsidy for oil and for other kind of minerals that allowed countries like Haiti to receive very, very cheap oil. So that when the U.S. In trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government prevented this oil from reaching Haiti, this revelation of this corruption in Haiti then began a protest against the essential U.S. client state in that country. Like, that's just such a kind of fascinating point where the U.S. can no longer play whack-a-mole with these regime change operations anymore. They're losing, I think, on many fronts in their attempts to keep this to keep this kind of power structure in place. I'd like to now, though, turn to Venezuela, where from what we were talking about essentially before we started recording, was that the situation in Venezuela has actually improved somewhat, that the worst of the U.S. sanctions may kind of be hitting, and that the Venezuelan economy may be making a kind of limited or partial recovery at this point, leading to a more full recovery. I guess sort of, how is it you're kind of getting that information? What is it that you've kind of seen in your study of Venezuela?
We have to remember, if we ever knew, because a lot of people don't know, that in 2014, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia colluded to lower oil prices drastically throughout the world. The main targets of this collusion were Iran and Russia. The goal was to hurt their economies by making oil less valuable, and these are countries that rely, to a large extent on oil for their revenue. But as the Independent of London pointed out, while Russia and Iran indeed were hurt by this, Venezuela was devastated by it, because Venezuela depends on oil for about 80% of its revenue. So this was really the first big blow to the Venezuelan economy. And then in 2015, Obama began the first round of sanctions against Venezuela, declaring Venezuela a unique threat to U.S. national security on two occasions to justify sanctions, which made it difficult for and more costly for Venezuela to obtain financing, international financing, for both its oil industry, for the upkeep of its oil industry, and for its ability to buy food and medicine abroad. Then in August of 2017, Trump really lowered the boom by sanctioning Venezuela to the extent that it couldn't obtain international financing at all for the things I just mentioned. And as you said, as a result of this, according to one study by the Center for Economic Policy Research, around 40,000 Venezuelans died as a result of those sanctions by Trump. And then Trump just continued to pile on, essentially setting up a complete embargo on Venezuelan oil. Citgo, Venezuela's U.S. oil company, its biggest cash cow for the country, was seized by Trump, and has not been given back. So you could see that the Venezuelan economy was injured greatly, and its ability to produce oil was hurt because it couldn't get the money or the materials it needed to keep the oil production up. So for years.
I'd also just like to interject when we're talking about the sanctions in place that a bank in the UK also just straight up stole $1 billion, I believe, worth of gold from Venezuela.
Yes.
When Venezuela went to ask for it back, they just said, no, this is ours now.
Yeah, so this is just outright theft that's happening here. The U.S. steals Citgo. As you mentioned, Britain stole $1.5 billion worth of gold. This is just an old-fashioned stick-up, right? And so one of the consequences of all this was that for years, Venezuela's oil production has kept falling. Well, there is some good news because now the Venezuelan oil production is making a comeback. They've now had some of the best numbers for oil production in years. And so this is some sign that they are weathering these sanctions largely by turning to other countries like Russia and China and India to sell their oil and to get help with their oil industry. And of course, Nicolas Maduro, has weathered this attempt to overthrow him, this attempt by the United States to overthrow him and install this Juan Guaido. It appears that Juan Guaido's sell-by date is passed at this point. In fact, there's now a corruption scandal surrounding him, which one result is that even parts of the opposition are now against him. So it appears that he's dead as a political force in Venezuela, and Maduro's quite strong now. So this is good news. And again, the U.S. press has really failed to acknowledge this. They've failed to acknowledge that this coup attempt, and that's what it is, that really began in January of this year, has failed. And it's failed miserably. And the U.S. media, by and large, have been cheerleaders for that coup, and they can't bring themselves to really acknowledge that it has failed and that they were wrong to begin with in thinking that it would succeed.
Yeah, and the U.S. media can't even bother to call things that are a coup. The other example of that being Bolivia, where there was a coup where the police and military forces loyal to this far right wing, literal fascist neo-Nazi opposition overthrew the government of Morales. They were ripping off their indigenous patches from their uniforms. They were saying we were police, we don't take no crap, in more vulgar words. I mean, it was there were right wing white paramilitaries going around the country. Killing and repressing indigenous leaders, et cetera, et cetera. The U.S. media couldn't even call that a coup. And so, I'd love to, on another episode at some point, compare and contrast the difference between the attempted coup in Venezuela and the successful coup in Bolivia, or at least so far successful coup in Bolivia, and why one failed and the other succeeded. But for now, I'd like to focus on something that, that really has been left out of the news as well, that you brought to my attention, which is that the situation in Nicaragua has also continued to improve after another failed U.S. right-wing coup there just, I believe it was a year ago or a little more than a year ago.
Yes, in poor Nicaragua, they never get any credit, and it breaks my heart. Nicaragua is my first love. I visited there in 1987 during the Contra War. I was 19 years old, and like many North Americans who went there, many Europeans who went there at that time, it really changed my life, and it changed how I viewed the world, And a lot of people who went there in the 80s have forgotten how important that revolution was. But that revolution has continued. And as a lot of people know, due to the pressure of the Contra War and the economic blockade of Nicaragua, the Sandinistas were voted out of power in 1990. And for about the next 17 years, Nicaragua suffered under a succession of neoliberal governments. Well, the Sandinistas were voted back into power in 2007. Daniel Ortega, who probably a lot of people know, one of the leading figures in the Sandinista party, became president. He's been president since that time. And with the exception of 2018, in which there was that attempted coup over the summer, the economy of Nicaragua has grown by nearly 5% every year since 2007. Poverty and extreme poverty have been lowered greatly. And Nicaragua has become one of the most equitable and stable countries in the Americas. Again, they get very little credit for this, but this is a fact. Another fascinating fact is that most recently, the UN body that measures gender equality in the world ranked Nicaragua as the 5th most gender equal society on earth, only after Finland, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland, your usual suspects. And then there's Nicaragua out of nowhere, the 5th most gender equal society on earth. Again, this is one of the best kept secrets in the world, but Nicaragua has accomplished this despite the Contra War, despite economic blockades. Now the U.S. has imposed the NICA Act, which is a very brutal round of sanctions against Nicaragua, which is preventing them from getting international financing, which the Sandinistas have been using for social programs and to eradicate poverty. So now they're going to have to struggle against that. But Nicaragua has really shown what a socialist government can do against great odds. The other thing they've done is Nicaragua is nearly 100% food sovereign, meaning that nearly all the food they eat, they grow themselves. They don't have to import. In fact, they are now exporting food. So it's kind of a small miracle, really, that's happened there, and it deserves a lot more attention.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to cover that in future episodes as well. I know we have just a couple minutes to wrap up. But yeah, I think turning to the examples of Nicaragua and Venezuela, not for the kind of demonization, but to actually look at what has gone so incredibly well. And
yes.
The fact that these were governments that the left wing in both Nicaragua and Venezuela at various times had to engage in this kind of armed struggle against these severely repressive capitalist states. But it's incredible to me that that something happened within Latin America that we now kind of recognize as the pink tide that has really not happened anywhere else in kind of the history of socialist struggle, which is that rather than sort of a revolution either through armed conflict or through kind of general strikes, instead a revolution happened in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, and in so many other countries. This struggle is still going on, but these governments came to power through elected means. So they found themselves, interestingly, socialist governments at the head of a capitalist designed state. And so the kind of contradictions that they've had to manage and the kind of violence they've had to weather as they attempt to improve the conditions for people's lives, while also managing this entrenched capitalist opposition, both within the civilian government and within the kind of deeper forces of the police and military that remain loyal to essentially these what we could call comprador governments, these neoliberal kind of neoliberal forms of government. It should be an inspiration to everybody, but we just don't see that from the U.S. left taking inspiration from these amazing struggles in Nicaragua and in Venezuela, and with, for instance, Morales in Bolivia. I know you have about a minute left. Is there anything else you'd like to kind of add before we wrap up?
No, it's just that I agree with you. I think the left in this country has forgotten, a lot of the lessons that they had learned certainly since the Vietnam War, and that is the need to fight U.S. imperialism and to stand in solidarity with these movements in other countries and to take inspiration from them. I think that a lot of that spirit has been lost, sadly, and I think people like you and me are really, trying to encourage people to regain that spirit. And I do want to make a plug for my new book, No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using humanitarian intervention to advance economic and strategic interests. I get into some of these very issues in that book.
Yeah, if you've never read one of Dan Kovalik's books, they're all fantastic, the ones I've engaged with, and they do such a good job of weaving together various kind of international issues. So I definitely would encourage people to go and check those out. Find Dan Kovalik's new book, No More War. I will definitely be reading it myself. So yeah, we're going to wrap up there. We have been joined by Dan Kovalik, of course, the human rights and labor lawyer, as well as the author of No More War. Thank you very much, Dan, for coming back on the show once again.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates on KOOP 91.7 FM Austin and is also broadcast on WHIV 102.3 FM New Orleans. We are available as a podcast on Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are podded. Stay tuned. And so this concludes our kind of long our long study at the various uprisings and protests against neoliberalism or neoliberal capitalism, however you would like to formulate that. I want to kind of make a few general points. First, that one journalist who was not able to join us for this particular series was Alina Duarte, who is a journalist based in Mexico City. She was going to be reporting on the protests in Colombia, on the strike in Colombia, and for various reasons had to back out of journalistic obligations. So I want to read a statement from her. You can find this on her Twitter. That's Alina, Alina Duarte, Duarte. Dear friends, family, loved ones, readers, and followers, unfortunately, I'm not writing to share news about the world, but rather about something personal. In a deliberate act of cowardice, my family has received 2 phone calls this week to, quote, warn us that, quote, they want to see tears of blood spill from the Duarte family. With the names and detailed knowledge of my family, they warned they wanted to, quote, lift us, levantar, which in Mexico is a colloquialism for kidnapping and murdering someone. It is well known that my family has joined social struggles for years, that we have been with the oppressed in their battles and denounced the oppressors. This is no secret. But it is also well known that we are not a family with economic or political privilege. For several generations, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and my father have been in commerce selling aluminum and steel goods. If they seek to extort us, we're not known for having large sums of money. My family's greatest resource wasn't what was used to feed us or pay for the schooling of the children and grandchildren. My family's greatest resource consisted of educating us with principles of honesty, educating us to make justice a shared horizon, and to give us enough bravery to survive in a world that is overly cruel, unequal, and violent. We were instilled with more than enough strength to face the world day and night. We are convinced that this, which sounds so simple and should be normal, is what has created more than one enemy for us. The Duartes, as they refer to us in these calls, have a clear conscience. We walk with our heads high, proud of who we are and what we do. If we have committed errors, we hope we have risen up to them and know how to make amends. There should be no doubt that being a Duarte is a source of pride, not shame. If these calls were a joke, they were in very poor taste. If they are meant to be a threat, then we are taking corresponding measures and investigations into these threats and have already been opened. If they are related to my work, I know that fascism is not a joke, that more than one person wants me buried, silenced, far from being able to continue denouncing the atrocities that are committed throughout the world. But I also know that the day they will come after me, it is unlikely I'll get a, quote, warning. Let me make it clear that the Duartes have not harmed anyone unless building a dignified world free of injustices and oppression can be used as a weapon against someone, then yes, we are guilty. With love and still standing, Alina Duarte. So I was talking with Alina over Twitter, messaging her on Twitter about coming on the show to discuss Colombia and her other reporting at the time that these threats were made. So naturally, she had to cancel our planned interview. So I brought on Dan Kovalik, who I know to be an incredible researcher, someone who has spent time in the places he's researched and really made it a point to stand with social and economic justice all across the world. I'm very glad to have had Dan on to kind of wrap up by talking about Colombia, where the protests have been so massive, as they have been in much of Latin America. So yeah, I think just generally some thoughts at the end, because I really planned this kind of for the end of the year. Once again, when we're talking about neoliberalism, we're talking about a system that is really about privatization. If you're not familiar with or if you don't really know the roots of the word privatization, which is something that's so normalized today, privatization actually is something that was kind of brought about as a word, as a concept during kind of the Hitler years of Nazi Germany, to describe this new phenomenon of taking these different state resources and putting them into the hands of private companies. And so that was continued. When we talk about neoliberalism, much of the roots for neoliberalism were actually kind of rooted in the fascism of some 30 or 40 years earlier. Neoliberalism as its own term kind of predates that, but nonetheless, we see the characteristics of neoliberalism first taking place in the fascist administration of Adolf Hitler, which is to say the increased police force, the privatization of all these social services, et cetera, and the kind of belief that everything can be commodified really is something that we see kind of continued. Of course, that goes back to Marx himself that said that. But yeah, it's been interesting that these uprisings seem to be of a much different tone than kind of previous uprisings, because as we talked about with Walter Smolarek at the very beginning, these different uprisings happen every about 8 to 10 years. Whenever there's a major economic downturn, whenever there's one of these global recessions, you see spontaneous uprisings, or whenever there's even in times of not recession, when there are kind of social issues, such as police repression, you also see these spontaneous uprisings happen. Regardless of the political situation, regardless of whether there's a strong organized left, spontaneous uprisings will happen simply because the oppressed people will rise up at certain pressure points against their oppressors. But in order to sustain this sort of thing, you do need that organized left presence. You do need the militarized discipline, because the thing is, like, the capitalist state is so used to dealing with this. These capitalist states, the U.S., for instance, has been essentially collecting data and researching and pouring massive amounts of money into understanding every facet of how to repress these protests. The U.S. state is very, very good at it, as are all these neoliberal client states. The U.S. state doesn't just have its own kind of internal networks, but also has, it gathers information, for instance, from kind of its project in Israel. If we can understand Israel to be in some ways an outpost of U.S. settler colonialism, the weaponry, the state repression tactics that are practiced in Israel against Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, those repression tactics are exported to places like Bolivia, so that we are actually seeing that the police forces in Bolivia are receiving training at this very moment, just past the coup. Just weeks, I don't think it's more than a month after the coup in Bolivia, the police forces are receiving this training from Israel on quote-unquote counterterrorism measures. That is to say that they instilled their coup, and now they're seeking to consolidate their coup with the sort of training of the Israelis, which are very practiced in these kind of crowd repression. So, just to understand that, the capitalist state in these situations has a level of organization that people on the left need to match. People who consider themselves to be any sort of ally of social and economic justice need to be looking at the situation and being like, how do I maintain that level of discipline? How do I maintain that level of kind of international thinking, of understanding what it is the roots of the problems are? For instance, if I don't understand, if I'm a leftist, I'm out in the streets, or if I'm just a person, I'm out in the streets, And I don't understand, like I'm against corruption. Nobody's for corruption. Very few people in the world are for corruption. But if I just see that as corruption, I don't see, for instance, the sort of deeper issues that cause that corruption, or if I don't understand the relationship, the economic relationships involved between the different capitalist factions in the state, for instance, I may find myself, supporting, a counter corruption against a different form of corruption, against, as we talked about, for instance, in Haiti. The plan in Haiti for a long time was Duvalier-ism without Duvalier. The plan was to keep the same kind of power relations in place, but simply replace the leader with something else. So like the state knows how to repress very well. The capitalist state knows how to do a bait and switch really well. I mean, on a very, very lesser example, we're seeing kind of that similar bait and switch with kind of Bernie Sanders versus Elizabeth Warren to some degree, where Elizabeth Warren represents just kind of a neoliberal restatement of Bernie Sanders' vision in ways that aren't actually a threat to the status quo. Whatever you might say about Bernie Sanders, I certainly have my criticisms that I don't really feel I need to reiterate here. But like the capitalist system knows how to do that bait and switch and whatnot. So like essentially what I'm trying to say is that we need that level of organization. If we want to bring about a truly revolutionary society where the needs of society are met, and they can be met, it is so easy to meet the needs of society, but we need to restructure the way the government functions. We need to think about what the state is in relation to the civilian government. And we need to think about what sort of tactics work, what sort of tactics don't work. I mean, this is talking about like centuries of research and centuries of a kind of lived experience of revolutionaries here, but we can understand some of these patterns. And I think generally speaking, what I'd like to say is that an absolute necessity is an organized left, is to say that it's not enough to just join people in the streets, but it's what happens behind the scenes. It's what happens before the protests happen. It's everything that happens leading up to the points of revolutionary struggle that is of utmost importance. So these people who are listening, who are like concerned about these things, who are enraged about the injustices they see around them, the thing they need to do is get involved now, become organizers, and become active participants in everything leading up to revolutionary points of struggle, and not just sort of passive people who show up for the protest and then go home, or who sort of like, opine all day on Twitter and who have the most correct opinions on Twitter or on Facebook or in these other kind of forums. No, it's about that connection to the people. It's about building that connection to the people. It's about building that organized left. That connection to the people is also a key part of it, because there are so many leftist movements that, for various reasons have refused to participate in these struggles. I think a good example would be in Lebanon right now. When we talked to Jana Nakal, one of the concerns I raised with her was the concern that the U.S. is simply using this as an excuse to like replace the Hezbollah faction of the government. The government there represented more or less by two different factions. They're somewhat closely related, one of which is Hezbollah, which has been in various ways resistant to Israeli imperialism or Israeli kind of settler colonialism and aggression in the Middle East. And so, I kind of asked, is there an attempt to co-opt this? And John Nicole said, of course, there's an attempt to co-opt this. But sort of the lesson I learned, I'm not really paraphrasing her, but just like sort of what she was trying to say was, or what I sort of interpreted her saying was that, yes, the U.S. was co-opting this, or the U.S. would attempt to co-opt this, but they've already co-opted this. They're already meddling in Lebanese politics. The left needs to be there to engage in these people's struggles, regardless of the contradictions within them. We see this in the Yellow Vest movement. I don't know if I'm going to get a chance to cover the Yellow Vest movement on this show, which is also very nuanced, because the Yellow Vest movement is truly a movement that does have factions from the left and from the right. But and some kind of American leftists, for instance, I don't think this is the bulk of people listening to my show, but some American leftists think, oh, the Yellow Vest movement, it's imperialist, it's in France, so like these people don't know what they're talking about. Well, that's why you have to be in the streets with them, right? That's why you have to sort of engage in the struggles that are not the struggles that you want there to be. If you want the struggles that are to become the struggles you want them to be, it has to be you that makes the difference. It has to be you that's staying involved and be, really kind of steeling yourself as like someone committed to a revolutionary mindset day in and day out, not just when it's convenient, not just when the struggles are most kind of politically expedient, but day in and day out. There's so much more I could really talk about. Unfortunately, we'll be continuing to cover all of these struggles as they develop as best we can. Of course, I am a worker. I don't like spend all of my time kind of doing just this radio journalism. But that is also kind of key to my own understanding, to my own political experience, is my experience as a worker, as someone who's trying to understand all these concepts and is trying to engage in these international struggles in their not spare time, but like in their time downtime, not kind of working for a living wage, for a survival wage. We'll continue to cover these. We have so much more coming up in the new year as well. That's really going to be a kind of retooling of the show. Just a little bit of meta commentary here for you, but we have several new segments that are going to be included in the show coming next year that I'm very excited about. We're going to be continuing our Socialism 101 monthly segment that we started earlier this year. We're going to have Street Forum, where we're going to be reaching out to homeless people throughout Austin, as well as organizers in the movement to end homelessness. So we're going to have Street Forum, where the idea is just to sort of bring people and allow people to have their own platform there. That's going to be our attempt to really kind of reach out and have a street presence with this radio show. We're going to have a specific segment about Latin American politics. We're going to be continuing Jacob Aronowitz's Texas politics segment. And of course, all of our favorites, Tech for the People, is coming back with Chris Carafa. I'm excited about our union segment. We're going to be talking with Ken Zarafis of the Education Austin, which is Austin's education union, for a teachers union rather. So Ken is going to be bringing us all of the latest union news of the month. And then we're going to have another segment on environmental justice that's going to be joining the show in January. I'm so excited. I hope that everyone has gotten a lot out of this kind of discussion of neoliberalism, and we have so much more coming in the new year. I think that's a great kind of way to wrap it up. Next week, we will be discussing the Bolivia coup, which is something that I didn't want to discuss too detailed as it was happening, because it was an unfolding situation. I don't want to say things have stabilized per se in Bolivia, because the truth is it's a very unstable situation within Bolivia after the right-wing coup attempt there. But we will be talking about kind of where the status quo kind of lies at the moment. We will be joined by Danny Shaw to talk about one of his recent articles on Bolivia, the right-wing coup there. And we will also be talking with some veterans, some U.S. Veterans who were in Bolivia at the time of the 2008 attempted coup, to talk about their experiences, and sort of why they became anti-imperialist, anti-war activists. So that's going to be kind of our two takes on Bolivia. We're going to set up the episode with a kind of Danny Shaw's analysis of how the coup unfolded. And we'll be talking with those veterans on what their personal experiences with Bolivia are, and why it is that they turned against the war, against general U.S. imperialism abroad. This has been People's Republic. I, of course, am Brianna Griffith. I don't really discuss this much on the show, but my pronouns are she, they. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Spreaker by going to People's Radio ATX. That's the username we use for this show, where you can also find all sorts of other news and analysis about the struggles for social and economic justice. This is Brianna Griffith, and I will hopefully join you again next week at this same time, wherever it is you are listening. Thanks for truly participating in community radio and community podcasting experience. This is news by the people and for the people. That's all we have for this week. You have been listening to People's Republic with Brianna Griffith. People's Republic originates in Austin, Texas, and is also available as a podcast on Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes, or wherever podcasts are podded. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at People's Radio ATX for more news and analysis. We are out of here.